Safely airborne, brakes on off, landing gear up, flaps up, speed brake in, landing light in. 3 ups, flasher out, flaps up, speed brake in, landing light in by 1:45.
35 years and the checklist for the jet I flew on pilot's course still rolls off the tongue. Military discipline, you may suggest? To that I say bumfo. I most certainly wasn't in the military when I started learning to fly at 16, but I can still elaborate on the mnemonic of the before landing checklist I learned 40 years ago. Brakes off, undercarriage down, mixture rich, master on, mags to both, fuel both and sufficient, all temperatures and pressures in the green, hatches and harnesses secure. With consistent use, many pilot checklists just roll off the tongue. There's a reason they're sometimes referred to as a patter or even mouth music, but sometimes that happens a little too easily. It's approaching 2:30 p.m. on the 20th of August 2008. Spanair Flight 5022, a McDonnell Douglas MD-82, sits on the tarmac at Madrid Barajas Airport, ready to start engines and finally be on its way to Gran Canaria. The flight is running late, the pilots having abandoned an earlier departure attempt and returned for maintenance action on an air temperature probe. The engineers have been unable to rectify the issue, but as the flight is not expected to encounter icing conditions en route, the aircraft's been cleared to depart with the probe disabled. The engines are started and the captain calls for the after-start checklist. But he interrupts the first officer, asking him to request a takeoff clearance. The interruption occurs at the point where the position of the flaps and slats are checked. Flats and slats extend from the wings, increasing lift at lower speeds. Without them, the aircraft needs a much longer runway to reach the speeds it needs to take off safely. During the taxi, the crew engage in conversation with an airline employee travelling as a passenger on the jump seat. This distraction, non-operational chit-chat, would later be seen to have been a contributing factor to what is to follow. The crew completes the taxi checklist, but the captain again omits the check of the flaps and slats when challenged for his takeoff briefing. Approaching the departure runway, the crew are cleared to line up and hold on the runway to allow for a preceding aircraft to depart. As they are lining up, 2 chimes in the cockpit indicate that the cabin is ready and, takeoff imminent, the first officer reads and the captain verifies the last of the checklist items, including that the flap and slat selections of 11 degrees each. Spanair 5022 is cleared for takeoff. The engines roar. The aircraft accelerates. At rotation speed, the first officer calls, "Rotate." But then, disaster. 4 seconds after the nose wheel eases off the runway, the stall warning blares. The control yokes shake violently in the pilot's hands. The stick shaker has activated to give a tactile indication that they are too slow for flight. The right wing drops. A bank angle warning sounds. Impact. The aircraft is destroyed, and 154 of the 172 passengers and crew are now dead. In the days following the accident, investigators make an upsetting discovery. Despite the cockpit voice recording indicating that both crew members had visually checked that the flaps and slats were at 11 degrees apiece immediately before takeoff, they weren't. The damaged flaps and slats are found stowed within the wings, and the flight deck flap selector is in the up position. Hello everybody, I'm Phil Wilkes. Welcome aboard the Like a Pilot podcast, where we unveil the soft skills pilots utilise every time they strap into those high-speed aluminium and carbon fibre giants we call airliners. This show is your ticket to understanding the how and why behind what makes aviation one of the safest modes of travel. So it's time to fasten your seatbelts and join me now as we embark on a journey through the skies, where pilot skills become the blueprints for high performance in any field. Checklists are great. Pilots love a good checklist, and, it would appear, so do listeners of the Like a Pilot podcast. I recently received a message from listener Kimberly from Adelaide, South Australia. Kimberly was on a long-haul road trip with her son, Angus, and wrote to tell me that they had been listening to the Check Like a Pilot episode and had introduced some checklists of their own along the way. In that episode, I also issued a warning. A checklist only serves its purpose if it is used as a checklist and is not given lip service. In this episode, we'll be looking at the dark side of using checklists, complacency and bias errors. But we'll also be looking at some tools for avoiding both, so it's not all dark. How could two professional aviators miss something as critical as setting the flaps and slats for takeoff? There are indicators right there on the flight deck. They had a checklist to make sure they referred to it. Hell, what were they looking at when they confirmed the settings out loud? It seems inexplicable. Until you understand bias. Bias is a systematic deviation from objective judgment that occurs when we use preconceived expectations and prior experiences to take a cognitive shortcut when interpreting information or perceived reality. The reason we have biases isn't necessarily a flaw, it's actually a feature of how our brains process information efficiently. The brain is constantly bombarded with sensory input. To avoid overload, it relies on shortcuts, heuristics, to predict what will happen next based on past experience and familiar patterns. Our cognitive system is designed to make rapid decisions by filtering and interpreting vast amounts of data based on patterns, expectations, and prior experiences. But this efficiency, this ability to perform tasks without conscious thought, can come at a cost. It allows us to react quickly, but it also makes us vulnerable to bias errors. Let's look at just two forms of bias: expectation bias and confirmation bias. Expectation bias occurs when we see what we expect to see rather than what is actually there, like glancing at a gauge and assuming the flap setting is correct, because that's what we anticipate. A perfect example of this was something I mentioned in the check episode. It relates back to my pilot training in the Air Force. During takeoff and go-arounds, our instructors wanted to make sure we weren't just going through the motions when checking engine instruments. At first, we had to call out the actual oil temperature and pressure values to prove we were looking. Later, once they trusted us a bit, we were allowed to simply say T's and P's in the green. They would occasionally pull the circuit breaker for the engine instruments just to catch anyone who was saying the words without actually checking or was suffering from inattention blindness. They were looking without seeing as their attention was elsewhere. Confirmation bias occurs when we selectively interpret information in a way that supports our pre-existing beliefs. We look for evidence that supports what we already believe, ignoring anything that contradicts it. A chilling example of confirmation bias is the fate of Singapore Airlines Flight 006 as it lined up for departure at Taipei's Chiang Kai-shek International Airport in the country of Taiwan on the 31st of October 2000. Outside, the leading edge of an approaching typhoon lashes the tarmac, with winds gusting up to 52 knots. Visibility is poor, the night thick with rain and darkness. But inside the cockpit, everything is calm, routine. The taxi had been careful and deliberate, slower than usual due to the slippery surface. The crew have even discussed the risks of rushing in such conditions. Satisfied, they confirmed their takeoff clearance. With the engine spooled up the aircraft begins its takeoff roll. And then, out of nowhere, shapes loom in the darkness. Concrete barriers, steamrollers, piles of rebar. Too late. The first impact tears away part of the landing gear. Then comes the excavator, hurled into the left wing and tail. The fuselage slams into the tarmac, shearing off an engine as the aircraft skids sideways. In seconds, flames erupt, turning the wreckage into an inferno. By the time it comes to rest, 83 of the 179 people on board are dead. Investigators would soon uncover a chilling truth. The crew had attempted to take off from a closed runway, one that was under construction. But how? They knew runway 05 right was shut down. They discussed it in their briefing. And yet, somehow, they still convinced themselves that they were on the correct runway, 05 left, the one still in operation. This wasn't a case of pilots recklessly ignoring instructions. Every step they took seemed reasonable, until it wasn't. The crew had chosen the longer runway, 05 left, for its added safety margin in the wet conditions, and were fully aware that the parallel runway, 05 right, was closed for construction. But as they approached 05 right, they made their critical error. Instead of taxiing straight ahead for another 300 metres to reach 05 left, the captain turned right on the nearer runway, 05 right. The lights leading onto 05 right were prominent, while the lights guiding them straight ahead to 05 left were spaced, farther apart. In the rain, the more obvious path seemed like the correct one. As they lined up, the first officer had noticed something odd. The paravisual display, the instrument meant to help align with the runway, hadn't activated. It should have, but instead of seeing this as a warning, taking a moment to stop and consider why it hadn't, they dismissed it. Never mind, we can see the runway, the captain had said. They assumed the instrument simply hadn't fully aligned yet. The crew completed their before takeoff checklist. By this point, their mental model was locked in. They believed they were on 05 left, and everything they saw was interpreted through that lens. The tragedy of Flight 006 wasn't that the pilots made a mistake, it was that they had multiple chances to catch it. The signs were there. They just didn't pass through the filter of confirmation bias. Runway 05 right had green centerline lights, standard for a taxiway, but not a runway. A correct runway would have had white centerline lights. And if they'd looked, they would have seen the large 05R painted on the pavement before turning. But by the time they lined up, those markings were behind or beneath the flight deck. The paravisual display didn't activate because they weren't on 05 left. The runway-aligned radio signal required for it to activate wasn't there. Yet, instead of questioning this, they dismissed it. And a magenta diamond on their primary flight displays indicated that the aid was actually working, out to their left, where 05 left was, but they didn't check it. Another tragic illustration of confirmation bias is Varig Flight 254. In 1989, the crew misinterpreted a flight plan and set off on a westerly heading instead of the planned northerly track, heading 270 degrees instead of 027 degrees. As they flew, they encountered discrepancies, weak radio signals with air traffic control, unfamiliar landscapes. But instead of questioning their initial error, they clung to it. They interpreted the conflicting information to fit their incorrect belief, ultimately leading to a crash landing in the jungle as they ran out of fuel. This accident highlights how powerfully confirmation bias can blind us to reality. Now, it wouldn't be a Like a Pilot episode if there wasn't going to be some takeaway for everyone along the flight plan track. So what about confirmation bias outside of aviation? One with far-reaching and even more deadly consequences is the spread of vaccine myths, significantly fueled by the now disgraced and deregistered former British physician Andrew Wakefield. Wakefield's 1998 study, published in The Lancet, falsely linked the MMR vaccine to autism. Ultimately, the General Medical Council debarred Wakefield and stripped him of his medical licence due to his dishonest and irresponsible research. But despite the retraction and rejection of Wakefield's fraudulent paper, many in the anti-vaxxer community still cling to and quote Wakefield in an unwavering adherence to his flawed hypothesis, despite overwhelming scientific evidence to the contrary, a clear demonstration of confirmation bias. Similarly, the persistent belief among flat earthers, moon landing conspiracy theorists, and 9/11 truthers who cling to demonstrably false evidence further illustrates the powerful grip of confirmation bias. Maybe you can think of times when you've been prone to making errors of these types in your own profession. Bias errors certainly aren't constrained to the world of aviation. Checklist complacency and bias can happen in many high-risk industries. For example, despite completing pre-surgical checklists that include marking the correct site, a Rhode Island surgeon operated on the wrong side of a patient's brain. Not once, but 3 times in the same year. Sticking with the medical theme, let's consider another example. The Theric 25 was a cutting-edge radiation therapy machine that tragically malfunctioned, delivering fatal overdoses. The root cause was a dangerous mix of technological overconfidence and confirmation bias. AECL, the manufacturer, was so convinced of the machine's safety that they dismissed patient reports of burns as impossible, ignoring critical warning signs. Then there was the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. During a reactor test, operators performed procedural steps but failed to actually verify key safety conditions. And we all know how that one ended. We're all also probably aware of the Costa Concordia grounding. Having sailed past the same island many times before, the captain of the Costa Concordia cruise ship performed a sail-by manoeuvre near an island without properly verifying the ship's clearance from underwater rocks. One final example.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
The Challenger space shuttle disaster. Engineers at the firm that designed and manufactured the solid rocket boosters warned of O-ring problems for a cold weather launch, but management ignored their warnings. They were looking for reasons to launch, not reasons to further delay an already delayed schedule.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
So, with the very real dangers of bias laid bare, how do we actively combat these inherent human tendencies? We're most susceptible to bias errors when completing highly rehearsed tasks, when we're fatigued, or following distractions, or in the lull after a period of high workload. You can't fix a problem you aren't aware of, so now you are aware of when you're most prone to making bias errors. Maybe a good start is just being a little more careful and mindful of what you're doing if you suspect you're bored, tired, or distracted. As we've already touched on, our brains love a shortcut, the easy, non-thinking solution. Doing things consciously requires more effort, so we need to decide to be more mindful while completing checklists and actively monitoring processes, even when monitoring seems unnecessary. If you catch yourself thinking, it should be okay, it always is, then that is a clear warning that you are becoming complacent and need to actively monitor and check what you're doing. You need to challenge what you're seeing, reevaluate what you believe to be true. When I'm asked to help new trainers or new pilots in a multi-crew environment, I tell them that you can't just watch what's going on and expect to pick up errors. You need to constantly be prompting yourself for what you expect to see happen next in a sequence and then confirm that it occurs. Just looking and expecting gaps in process or errors to jump out at you won't work. you need to be actively monitoring each step in the process. One thing pilots definitely do in regard to combating bias is to minimise distractions. We'll close the flight deck door if we're about to brief, and we have strict rules around non-operational conversation in the most critical phases of flight, from closure of the cabin doors until airborne, and again from mid-descent until the aircraft's at the gate. This is known as a sterile flight deck, and beyond company policy, in some jurisdictions it's the law. Remember that conversation the Spanair crew were having during taxi? It bears a striking resemblance to what occurred while Delta Airlines flight 1141 was taxiing at Dallas-Fort Worth for a flight to Salt Lake City on August 31, 1988. Engaging in casual conversation on various matters unrelated to the operation, the flight deck crew were distracted from properly performing their duties and failed to extend flaps for takeoff or perform the pre-takeoff checklist designed to capture such procedural failures. Accidents like these are the very reason why pilots have the sterile flight deck rule. Another golden rule for pilots is that, if we are distracted during a checklist, we'll begin again, from the start. Another way we can avoid bias errors is to make use of multiple sensors when performing tasks. We touched on this ever so briefly in the Check Like a Pilot episode, but I think it's worth revisiting in a little more depth. Pilots definitely use this tool, but today we're going to go for a little journey to Japan to meet the masters. Putting aside the exception of the horrendous crash at Amagasaki in 2005, Japanese railways are world renowned for their safety. With less than a 0.02 passenger deaths per billion passenger kilometres, Japanese rail safety compares more than favourably with airline travel and is an order of magnitude better than the worldwide average railway statistics. The levels of safety achieved on Japan's bullet train operations, the shinkansen, are even more staggering. Since the first Shinkansen service in 1964, over 10 billion passengers have travelled without a single passenger fatality from derailment or collision. Travelling at either of the business ends of a train in Japan, you can't help but notice the drivers and conductors, immaculately dressed in their jackets, caps and white gloves, animatedly gesticulating and apparently in conversation with themselves. The Japanese call this shisa kanko, typically translated into English as pointing and calling. Shisa kanko is used as an awareness tool for avoiding mistakes. The idea is that whenever something needs confirmation, it is deliberately focused on, pointed at, and its actual status verbalized. Let's consider some examples. Passing speed signals, a driver calls out the speed limit. Limit 80, distance 500. Points at his or her speedometer and enunciates the actual speed to confirm compliance. Passing signal lights, a driver points to the signal and announces its status. A driver points to their timetable to confirm the time, down to the second that they need to leave the station to achieve schedule, and confirms the actual time by pointing, of course, at their watch. There's a very good reason that the average annual Shinkansen punctuality is in the order of seconds. And shisa kanko isn't just for train drivers. After closing the train doors, the conductor points at their instrument panel and verbally confirms all doors closed before letting the train leave the station. The exact origin of shisa kanko appears to be uncertain, but I like the story about the steam train engineer, Yasuichi Hori, that dates back to the early 1900s. In the smoky cab of the steam train, concerned that he'd go through a signal by mistake due to failing eyesight, Hori would call out the signal status to his fireman, who would call it back as confirmation, just like the challenge and response checks we discussed in the checklist episode. Observed as an excellent way of reducing errors, Hori's kanto auto, or call and response, was encoded as standard railways procedure. Pointing would follow a few decades later. But does shisa kanko actually reduce errors and improve safety? In 1994, the Japanese Railway Technical Research Institute conducted a trial comparing the error rates in completion of a simple task with no specific steps taken to prevent errors, with the addition of adding either pointing or calling, and with the use of pointing and calling. Pointing and calling produced the least amount of errors, with a reduction by almost 85% over taking no specific measures. Within 2 years of New York subway train conductors implementing pointing and calling, incidents of incorrectly berthed trains fell by 57%. And in 2011, Osaka University set out to validate shisa kanko in their study, the effects of finger pointing on calling on cognitive control processes in the task switching paradigm. To put it simply, the Osaka University study concluded that pointing and calling improves accuracy when having to evaluate information prior to making distinct decisions based on that information. It can even reduce response time. So, why does it work? As pilots, we often use touch drills for mental rehearsal of where our hands and feet need to go. In much the same way, pointing and calling make sure our eyes and brains have gone where they needed to have been. Shisa kanko heightens mental focus at key points where errors are likely to occur. It is also multisensory in that it requires interaction between the operator's brain, eyes, hands, mouth, and ears. By engaging the muscles of the mouth and arm and hearing your own voice, your brain is stimulated and you're more alert than if you isolated or removed any of these interactions. So how does this relate back to the flight deck? And more importantly, how can you incorporate the power of shisa kanko into your life? In multi-crew operations, many pilots use pointing and calling. For example, when changing altitude, one pilot will dial the newly assigned altitude into the altitude selector and leave their finger on the selector until the other acknowledges. When making flight management system changes, many operators require their crew to verify routing amendments on the navigational displays and point to the entry key before they are inserted or executed. And Airbus has a very specific way of calling out actions in checklists. For example, if the checklist says, close the crossbead valve, the pilot must first say, air, pointing to the air conditioning controls, then crossbleed, pointing to the valve control, and finally, close, performing the action. They then confirm on the displays that the valve has actually closed. This system is designed to prevent mistakes and keep both pilots fully aware of what's happening, the shared mental model we've spoken about so often in our previous episodes. In an attempt to avoid accidents such as Singapore Airlines 006 or the 49 lives lost when a Comair CRJ used the wrong runway at Lexington in 2006, one airline I know of encourages their pilots to verbalise their taxi instructions. I'll be taking the next taxiway to the right. Many pilots enhance this shared mental model with the addition of pointing to the taxiway signs to confirm the intention against the clearance. Next taxiway to the right is Alpha, I'll be turning left there. Pointing and calling gives both pilots added chances to catch errors that may go unnoticed compared to simply looking and acting. Pointing and calling is not just a multi-person tool either. As we have already seen in our example, unaccompanied train drivers use it to remain mindful of their own actions. There is no one to hear or observe their actions, but the verbal and tactile actions reinforce the information received and perceived by the operator and help the self-initiation of error detection. Pointing and calling is also an excellent training tool. When training, it's much easier for the student to follow the instructor's thought processes when each critical step is shown physically and announced. Likewise, it is much easier for the instructor to follow the student's thought processes, stop errors, and avoid training bad habits. Where could you adopt shisa kanko in your own occupational life? Do you use checklists at work? Do you actively check and confirm what you are seeing? Or do you just recite the correct mouth music, the expected responses? Do you actually check, or are you giving lip service to the checklist? Why not add a point to your challenge and response calls? Think how much more meaningful teaching your kids to cross the road could be with some added shisa kanko. What about medical staff administering medication? Could pointing to the medication, the dose, and the patient's name before administering prevent dangerous errors? What about pointing to each figure as you verify it against supporting documents when checking financial reports? Or pointing to each component of scuba diving equipment when you perform a buddy check? Or what about something less exciting, something as simple and mundane as proofreading important documents? Pointing to each word as you read it out aloud could prevent your brain from doing that fantastic pattern recognition thing that it does, correcting errors that are present and seeing what was meant rather than what was actually written. One final example, the good old pre-insult checks. What if you actually considered each addressee on a potentially incendiary email before pressing send? Shisa kanko, pointing and calling, is a powerful tool. It promotes focus and attention while reinforcing correct procedure. Combined, the two steps help avoid complacency and errors. Consider where pointing and calling could enhance your own operation. Think, where could you act more like a Japanese train driver? We're often told, from a young age, that pointing is rude. Well, I'm here to tell you that when it comes to safety, point away! Japanese rail and us pilots, along with university studies, disagree with your mum on this one. But maybe don't point at her, just to be safe. In essence, combating bias requires a combination of self-awareness, proactive vigilance, and the implementation of structured techniques like sterile cockpit and shisa kanko. By actively employing these strategies, we can mitigate the risks associated with bias and enhance safety and performance in any field. Until next time, thank you for listening to the Like a Pilot podcast. For more information, check out the show notes at philwilkes.com/podcast. The Like a Pilot podcast is written and produced by me, Phil Wilkes. If you'd like to support the Like a Pilot podcast, our Patreon page is available at patreon.com/likeapilot. And if you've liked the show, please remember to rate, share, and review.